Hello, and welcome to the Batman Star Wars Unlimited mashup you never knew you needed. I'm D-House with Unplayable, and this is the Brown Batman deck tech. What's up, everybody? I am so excited to bring you this deck tech today. This is definitely a deck that came straight from my heart and my excitement for Chewie. You know, when Chewbacca was spoiled early in the set's reveal, I was really excited about it, and then in practice, it just didn't work the way I wanted to. And then we had out in Europe a big 90-person tournament where someone played Chewbacca green to the top 8, and that got me sort of thinking about Chewbacca again. And I think the Chewbacca green variant is great with U-wing reinforcement and everything, but I wanted to add my own touch to it, and that's when I thought of one card in particular, and that card is, of course, Bombing Run. Bombing Run is a weird card. It hasn't quite found a place, but it says choose an arena, ground or space, deal 3 damage to each unit in that arena. And I started thinking, what if we equipped Chewbacca with a utility belt of stuff that could take out stuff on the other side and increase its power with his grit, because obviously on his leader side, he's got Sentinel and grit. And then what if we paired him with a bunch of other stuff that has grit? So when you Bombing Run, you clear out a side or do a lot of damage, and you also boost up all of the power of your own guys. And so it started with that concept of Chewbacca red with Bombing Run. I started putting the deck together. I added it to swoodb.com, and Parker, the madman, the mad scientist behind the naming algorithm, the random name assigned to this deck was Brown Batman. And I could not think of a better name for this concept because obviously Chewie, the old brown Wookiee, and then Batman, who has his utility belt, and he doesn't have any superpowers. He just blows things up with his bat bombs and his Batmobile and like all these things, and he just finds a way to do it. But there's a lot of destruction in his path. So that's where the name Brown Batman came from. But I also call it Bombing Run Chewie. And I've had a ton of fun playing this deck, and you might too. So here's the deck. First, let's look at the 2 costs, because Chewie wants to drop some Sentinels early, play a unit that costs 3 or less from your hand. It gains Sentinel for this phase. Now, in this deck, the thing I really enjoy about this deck is that it can be extremely aggressive early on because you've got a lot of red hero stuff, and can put a lot of early pressure on your opponent. So if they're not running aggro, you can kind of be the aggro early on with some of these low-cost units while also protecting your base, and force them to go into hyper control mode, which you're kind of okay with because you get to this place where you hit 6, 7, 8 resources, and you start to drop some of these top end cards that swing the game in your favor either way. So you've already done a bunch of damage, they're controlling, haven't really built a board, and all of a sudden you've got a bunch of units that can close the game. I do think there are some scenarios where you maybe haven't done a lot of damage, but with the right units out there and a well-timed Bombing Run, you could just close the game out in 1 turn, even after having not done a lot of damage. So, but like I said, let's look at the low cost, the first turn plays. We've got 3 Spec Force soldiers. This is actually a recent addition. I was running Partisan Insurgent because of the 4 health, and it could survive a Bombing Run. It could also potentially force an opponent to trade, or not trade, maybe not trade, but throw 2 units into him just to kill him because he's got 4 health. But honestly, the only doing 1 back was kind of a problem, especially with like Viper probe droids where they're doing 3 to my Sentinel, but they're not dying in return. So I thought, you know what? Why don't I throw Spec Force Soldier, because it's a rebel, which is, I want to do lots of rebel synergy in this deck early on with Fleet Lieutenant, Wing Leader, and then also gets rid of Sentinel, because sometimes you get Chewbacca with a bunch of damage, and Chewbacca wants to swing for 6, 7, 8 damage, and there's this stupid little cell block guard sitting in the way, and you need to get around it to just attack the base. And so Spec Force Soldier is a nice 1-drop for later that can do some interesting things. So of course we're running Sabine. Sabine is just such a great unit for first turn. Got 3 health, probably doing 3 damage on attack. There's what's not to love. Sabine is so good. Then on the space side, we've got, of course, 3 A-Wings and 3 restored arcs. Again, A-Wing a little bit more aggressive. The arc is a little bit more control and stabilizing and some healing in there. And so this is sort of our early game. You know, you don't love to Sentinel a Green Squadron A-Wing, but you can if you really need to. But most of the time, if an opponent sees the A-Wing on the table, they're thinking, oh my gosh, I need to get rid of this thing immediately. Because when you look at our 3 cost units, we've got Fleet Fleet Lieutenant, which is just wants to buff your rebel stuff and attack the base, or use a Spec Force to do 4 to something really easily. You gotta love these Fleet Lieutenants. You also have Wing Leaders, so Wing Leader is, of course, adding experience tokens and making them even scarier. And then I've got Yoda in here too for more kind of stabilizing control, restore 2. He's also just a great Sentinel at 4 health, and if they kill him, then I get an extra card, which is also really helpful. So sometimes there's some awkward stuff that happens here with like Yoda not being a rebel, and some other cards I'll show you that's not in the rebel theme, but Yoda's just good. You just love him. So moving on in our cost curve of just the units, I'll get to the events later, but in our cost curve, we're gonna move on to 4. Of course, I gotta run Baze. Baze is interesting because he doesn't always have Sentinel. It's only when you have the initiative, but there are times where you're being the aggressor where you actually do end up with the initiative and he pops out and protects your base. And of course, he's got grit. We're gonna start seeing a little bit more grit on the table. So Baze has been very effective in this this Chewie shell. Also at 4, we've got K2SO. Now K2SO does not give a Sentinel and doesn't have grit, but what you can do with K2SO is you can get him on the table, you can attack, you can even take out some Sentinels or do some damage, so that when it comes time for the bombing run turn, you can bombing run and you can kill your own K2SO and do 3 more damage to the opponent's base, which is a cheeky little play sometimes. Moving on to 5, this is a little bit, I don't know, it's a weird spot, 5. So I've got Rugged Survivors in this spot at 2. Obviously he has grit, so you know, theoretically this could get up to upwards of 7 damage, and if you've got Chewie out there, you're going to be drawing a card. Rugged Survivors is not my favorite in this deck. I've found it a little bit underwhelming. So if I were to cut a card right from this shell right immediately, I might straight up just replace this with Vigilant Honor Guards just for that extra Sentinel. Got 6 health, can survive a bombing run. If you want to get really aggressive, you could run that red siege tank that it's a 5/4 with grit. Would not recommend it, but if you're wild and you want to do some fun things, maybe you throw that in there. But this is a little bit of a flex spot, I think. So in theory, you could have grit units at 4 with Baze, Rugged Survivors at 5, and then as we move into 6, we've got Gorilla Attack Pod, which is a little bit of the secret sauce that really makes this deck work. I mean, what's not to love about the Attack Pod? It comes in with grit as a 4/6. It's Rebel, so it can get buffed by Wing Leader and Fleet Lieutenant, and it can come in ready if a base has 15 or more damage. So this comes in, you know, you can just attack, go face. You can leave it. You can do the bombing run, and all of a sudden this is attacking for 7 but it'd have to be over 2 turns, of course. But I love this Gorilla Attack Pod, and you see it more in some of the more aggressive decks. So some people are surprised to see this in a Chewie deck. I love it. I'm a big fan. And then of course so that's at 6. Now we're getting to our 7 resource turn. Now this is kind of a key turn because this is when you can deploy Chewie, which is always good timing because you can stop some of the damage that's coming in, but it's also the turn where you can play Luke Skywalker or Mace Windu at the 7 cost. And both of these you are happy to see because they do different things, right? Luke does not have grit, but he's just such a game shaping force. If you can drop Luke in at 7 and defeat a unit, maybe even take out a Sentinel so Chewie can attack the base, or just control on the space side, because the space in this deck is a little bit weak if you can't keep those A-Wings out there. Or Mace just comes in, kills something real quick, and then he's ready. And again, on this 7 resource turn, you're going to be doing a lot of damage between Chewie, the Gorilla Attack Pod, potentially Mace, and a lot of ready stuff. So this is a key turn where you drop these bombs at 7, and it's like, where do I turn my attention to? Do I try to get rid of Chewie the Sentinel? Do I try to kill that Luke before he's restoring 3 next turn? Do I try to ping off the last damage on Mace? Oh wait, I can't because Chewie is sitting there protecting Mace from getting damaged, so Mace could get in multiple attacks or just an attack on something and then attack the base for 5. What I like about like Gorilla Attack Pod and Mace Windu is essentially they're both most of the time going to be ready to do 4 or 5 damage along with Chewie at 7. So you're just doing a bunch of damage and it's a ton of fun. Let's look at the events and upgrade package. We've got 2 Carabast. So I go back and forth between Carabast and Open Fire and what's best in this deck. Carabast is so good for clearing Sentinels, those pesky Emperor's Royal Guards that come out in the Palpatine deck. You got to get rid of it. These are very good. These also are helpful for killing big spaceships that you can't really deal with. So you can take all the grit damage and shoot it over in space and kill something that way. Got one open fire. You could probably play around with these numbers 2 and 1 and kind of switch to taste. There is like a cheeky play here where you could open fire on your own grit unit just to give it that extra power to turn that 4 damage to a unit into 4 damage on the base, which you could also technically do with Carabast in unique ways. So you kind of have to think about it a little bit, but it's a fun one. I've got 2 copies of Takedown, 2 copies of Vanquish. Vanquish is in there mainly for Fett's Fire Spray and other problematic units that might hit the board and not let me keep my grit units on the table. So I've got 1 each in the sideboard. I'll get into a little bit so you can switch that around as you need. And then of course 3 copies of Bombing Run because that's the theme of the deck. Old Brown Batman. 3 copies of Electro Staff. Electro Staff on Chewbacca is just, chef's kiss. Oh, so sweet. You turn him into a 4/11 and then he starts taking damage and he gets stronger. If you get multiple Electro Staffs on Chewbacca, you will be so happy. He does great work with the Electro Staff. It does also work on some of the other grit units. You know, you've got Bays that can actually get a lot stronger with an Electro Staff, even Yoda if you need some of that restore. I love Electro Staff. I usually try to keep 1 in hand for the Chewie deploy turn, and we'll have a great time. In the sideboard, we've got Disabling Fang Fighter. You know, it's just, the Fang Fighter is a good quality sideboard card to deal with a lot of the pesky upgrades that are coming out, whether it's the Fallen Lightsabers, the Jedi Lightsabers, you know, whatever with the Chariots out there. Just a great one. Make 3 copies of Make an Opening. This, if you're playing against yellow villain, and especially Boba, you want 3 Make an Openings because it kills the TIE Defender. It goes behind the shield. It heals your base, which is great because you're trying to stall to get to the Chewie turn anyways. So that's what that's in there for. And then, like I said, 1 copy of Open Fire, 1 Takedown, 1 Vanquish. And then I fill it out with 1 copy of Redemption. We're typically getting to that resource to 8. And so if you find that you're in a longer type game and you want to sideboard this in, this could be a nice surprise. And then again, more Sentinel for them to deal with. Then you've got Sentinel on all the sides and they're just trying to figure out how do I deal with all the Sentinel stuff to get to Brown Batman's Wayne Manor, so to speak. Someone needs to make a Wayne Manor base for me. All right, so that's the deck. As I mentioned, there are some subtle changes you could do. You could switch out the Rugged Survivors for something else in that spot. I do think I like the Vigilant Honor Guards, but I wanted to stay on theme with the grit. Let's see. Other things you could toy around with is Moment of Peace to give a shield token to a unit because you're using these great units. Sometimes they get really vulnerable. You could toy around with that. I tried it a little bit. It wasn't my favorite, so I did end up cutting it, but it certainly is an option. If you want to go more upgrades, the Jedi Lightsaber is great. You've got lots of Jedi in here. At one point, I actually had Kanan in here, but he didn't really fit in the theme. But you could drop the Rugged Survivors for Kanan, and then you've got the Jedi Lightsaber for Yoda, for Kanan, for Luke, and for Mace, because you got these Force units out there. And then if you really want to do Force variant, then you could add in, of course, the Force Throw, which is lots of great control, lots of good damage. But I just think at some point you're moving farther away from the purpose of the deck and some of the spiciness of the deck. That's why, like, you might think I would be putting in the Wilderness Fighter at 3 because it comes in as a 2/4 with shielded as a Sentinel, and certainly that is an option. I just preferred to have Yoda in that spot and have the Fleet Lieutenant for the early aggression. So I think that will about do it. System Patrol Craft is another good unit that you could throw on the sideboard for more Sentinel. Cheaper sideboard in space if it feels like that's where they're really going. And Obi-Wan Kenobi, another fine option. But that's it. That's the Brown Batman, guys. I've had a ton of fun. It's probably the most fun I've had playing a deck in Star Wars Unlimited. I didn't mention Tarkin Town. I probably should mention Tarkin Town. Tarkin Town is so great in this deck because you drop these Sentinels. If they attack into them, they take damage. You can immediately take care of it with Tarkin Town, which is always valuable. And even just some of the stuff with Carabast, even if Carabast for some reason can only do 1 damage, and then you can finish it out with Tarkin Town or Bombing Run into Tarkin Town. There's lots of good options there. So I do like Tarkin Town in this particular deck, but that'll do it. If you play Brown Batman, if you throw it on the table at your weeklies, please let me know. I'd love to know what you think about the deck, and don't be afraid to swerve from the beatdown to the control and back from the control to the beatdown. A lot of the, I think the skill of this deck is figuring out when you are either one, which is a lot of Star Wars Unlimited in general, but I found that's what the difference in a
lot of games, is figuring out when I need to go face, when I need to slow down, build for my kind of bigger end finishers as well. So that'll do it from the Brown Batman. Hope you enjoyed it, guys. Let me know what you think in the comments, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.